It's our pleasure to continue the Brown Medical School archival series with a discussion today with Professor Richard Besdine. Today is the 13th of April 2007. We're sitting in the Gerontology Center at Brown University on Stimson Street. I'm Jeffrey Borkan, MD, PhD, Chair of Family Medicine, and head of the ad hoc committee for archival material. Professor Besdine, if you could tell us just a little bit about how you came to be at Brown, a little bit of your life story and career.
It's a pleasure. I was born and grew up in the Bronx in New York. Went to a private high school, Horace Mann, and got a superb education. Went to Haverford College, where I learned to love learning, and on to Penn Medical School. I was an English major in college, took a lot of biology besides, and in medical school I continued the basic research that I began doing in the biology department in college. And in medical school, in that era of the 1960s, my faculty were unanimous in telling me that the noblest thing I could do in medicine was to pursue basic science while being a physician and taking care of patients with a small portion of time. And I listened clearly and obeyed, and I trained in what was then basic immunochemistry, and pursued that along with training in internal medicine and infectious diseases for about 6 or 7 years. And as time went by, I found that in the laboratory, my professional satisfactions were few and far between. Getting grants funded, getting papers published, an occasional breakthrough in science didn't have me on a daily basis really excited about what I was doing. And I had a moonlighting job in a nursing home. And that, I realized, became my major source of satisfaction. And it wasn't a matter of loving old people to death. I guess that's a bad image. It was more that as a proud, well-trained, and smart internist, I found that the very old, multiple disease, multiple medication, multiple functional impairment patients, if you got it right and had good outcomes, were the most satisfying to take care of. And so I finally broke down and told my chairman of medicine, Howard Hyatt at the Beth Israel, that I was not cut out to be a wet lab basic scientist, and told him about my interest in older patients. And at the time, this was 1971, there were no American academic training programs in geriatrics. And so I went to Scotland to train in geriatrics with Sir Ferguson Anderson, the first chaired professor of geriatrics in Europe. And that was one of several life-changing experiences I had. Came back to the Harvard faculty, as I've come to say, a sheep in wolf's clothing, in the division of immunology and infectious disease, and determined to build an American program. And we did. Jack Rowe joined me in 1975, and we built the division on aging at Harvard Medical School, established clinical and educational programs at the Hebrew Rehabilitation Center for Aged, launched the first fellowship, research grants, and all went wonderfully. Then in 1986, I got recruited away to the University of Connecticut, to the first chair at a public university in aging in the US, to build not just a medical school program on aging, but a university-wide aging program. The Travelers Insurance Company endowed a professorial chair. And so I went to UConn, and we built, again, a thriving program. When I left there in 2000, we left behind, having started as one person, we left behind a center on aging with 35 faculty, 29 physician geriatricians, and 6 PhDs, a thriving fellowship, lots of grants, but circling back just a bit, in the middle 1990s, I took a sabbatical and went to the agency formerly known as HCFA, the Healthcare Financing Administration, now CMS, because as a professor of geriatrics, I thought I should learn something about policy and financing, about which I knew almost nothing. So I went there to work with Bruce Vladeck, one of my heroes. He wrote the book in 1972, a banner year for him and for me, called Unloving Care, Nursing Home Care in America. And that book propelled an Institute of Medicine report in the early 1980s, which culminated in OBRA 87, or the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1987, that established for the first time federal standards of quality and performance for American nursing homes. Anyway, he was is still a brilliant healthcare policy analyst and policy formulator, has wonderful ideas, and a short time into my leisurely professor's sabbatical, he asked me to become chief medical officer of that agency with its 400 physicians and nurses, and also to lead the Health Standards and Quality Bureau, which was a $2 billion, 800 employee small operation charged with setting standards, enforcing quality, and also improving quality for 70 million Americans, Medicare beneficiaries and Medicaid recipients. And that was probably the second biggest life-changing professional experience I had. And I became passionate about improving quality of care for older people. At the time, my wife, our Dean for Public Health, Fox Weddle, was Deputy Director of the National Institute on Aging, and she and I had been commuting between Connecticut, central Connecticut, actually the Hartford Airport, and DC. And I finished my, actually I took a leave of absence to extend my sabbatical for several years, went back to the University of Connecticut, was professionally frustrated because it had very little in the way of policy-related research in healthcare. And also I was continuing to live apart from my wife, and we both think we have a good marriage. We may both be wrong, but we both agree on that. And so we commuted for 6 years and missed 2 weekends in that time, airplane commuting. And I remember one August night in 1998, I had flown down from Hartford on a Friday, 2 hours late, not unusual, and we were sitting having dinner, and I raised to sip my glass of wine, and I said almost offhandedly, "When are we going to get our lives back together?" And then said the words that again changed both our lives. I said, "Are we waiting for one of us to get sick?" And it kind of stuck in my throat, and we made the decision that weekend to look as a couple for the first time for jobs. And to make this long story end, the best jobs by far were here at Brown. I came to build an integrated program on aging for the university and the affiliated hospitals, and Fox came to be the associate dean for public health and get the public health program accredited and a master's up and running. And of course now, fast forward, that was accomplished quickly, and we're on our way to being a school. So I got to Brown. I met the 245 people I thought I needed to have a face relationship with in order to build a program on aging. I came here in the summer of 2000, and over the next year began building through the Gerontology Center on the campus side and the Division of Geriatrics in the Department of Medicine on the hospital's side, to try to bring some coordination to those two previously absolutely separate entities. And I think it was crucial that people here, Vince Moore chaired the search committee. Actually, he chaired both search committees that brought Fox and me to Brown. But it was his doing that united the leadership of the Gerontology Center on the one hand and the Division of Geriatrics. And we've also made close working relationships with the basic biologists. And that seemed to be going pretty well. And then in the spring of 2002, less than 2 years after I came here, Dean Marsh resigned, and I was asked to be interim dean. And I was at first shocked, honored, but a bit, well, dismayed. And as I thought about it, one of the structural problems of the medical school became evident. The reason I was, as a wet behind the ears newcomer, considered qualified to do this job is that I was one of only a few senior faculty in the medical school with major administrative responsibility and therefore understanding of the systems of operation, both on the hospital side, and it wasn't just the lifespan hospitals. The aging program was in all the hospitals except pediatrics, and also had similarly intersecting responsibilities on the campus. So I understood both portfolios, if you will, of the medical school and the Division of Biology and Medicine, and in talking with the brand new provost, who still was in Chicago when he and President Simmons decided to ask me to serve as interim dean.
And could you say a bit about the process, who approached you, how you were asked?
It was whirlwind. I still have the original emails. It was in late, I think, Dean Don Marsh resigned something like the 1st of April, or at least it became public, and announced his departure in early April. And not long thereafter, I sent a note to Ruth Simmons talking about what I saw as some not optimally functional elements of the Division of Biology and Medicine in the medical school, not the least of which was this cumbersome name and identity that managed to confuse almost everyone. The Division of Biology and Medicine and Brown, what was then Brown Medical School, not WAMSBU, Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University, which is what we are now. And that remains, I think, in my view at least, an impediment to the familiarizing of the world with the medical school and getting appropriate levels of recognition. There remain, I'm fast forwarding now, but one of the early tasks that Provost Zimmer and I took on together was the need to examine and consider modification of the routes of admission to Brown Medical School. As you know well, in the year 2002, if you were number one in your class at Harvard College, Stanford, University of Chicago, Princeton, any college but Brown, you couldn't take the MCATs and apply to Brown Medical School. There were, I think I counted 7 distinct routes of admission, each one taking several sentences or a paragraph to explain, resulting in the outside world thinking that either Brown didn't have a medical school or there was something very peculiar about it. And so we, again, I'm jumping around historically, but it strikes, this was, I think, one of the important things that we did during the interim was to reinstitute standard admission route for Brown Medical School, and we launched a 2-year pilot. The current first-year class of 2010 is the second year of the pilot. The pilot has been, by any measure, very successful, And I'm delighted that the medical school continues to grow the number and proportion of the class coming through the standard admission route. The program in liberal medical education, which I don't think I have to explain in this process, it is a very important route to the medical school and brings into the medical school absolutely outstanding students, but the diversity and the recognition for the medical school, very important to have this standard route of admission. Coming back to the beginning of the interim period, I think there were, the way it happened, I sent Ruth Simmons an email talking about some of the problems that I saw the medical school facing. The enormous chasm between the clinical environment where all our physician faculty were appointed and the campus where public health and biological sciences resided, and that the interaction, both scientific and also cultural, just didn't occur. And so not only was there isolation of these two critical parts of the faculty and administration of the medical school, not only were they isolated from one another, but in fact I could testify firsthand, moving in both camps freely as I did, spending just about half my time in the hospitals and half on the campus, that there was outright suspicion and hostility by some faculty on each side of that chasm. And so I talked about that in an email along with the routes of admission and a few other things. And the next thing I knew, I was having dinner with Provost Designee Zimmer at the Agora restaurant at the Westin Hotel, and we spent 5 hours over dinner. And at the end of the dinner, he said, "Will you be," it was an interview, "will you be our interim dean if the corporation approves you?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" Sort of like becoming chief medical officer and health standards and quality bureau director at HCFA. It was an offer I couldn't refuse, given I had already thought a lot about the structural and administrative problems of the medical school. How could I let someone else try to do it? And it was a very dynamic time.
Just before, did you have any reservations about the effect on, you would come here as a named professor, the effect on the gerontology center in geriatrics?
I thought about that a great deal, but I thought about that when I wrote my note. Not that I imagined I would, as a result of the note, be considered to be the interim dean, but what I decided, even in allocating the time to think about the problems of the division and the medical school, is that I was spending less time on the geriatrics and gerontology program, and I made the decision that it was a higher value to Brown to bring what value I could to administrative matters in the medical school. And so when actually offered, I worried for about a day, but then decided I had to do it. And again, at the time, there was a real sense of urgency and maybe crisis surrounding the relationships between the university administration and the faculty and clinical departments. It wasn't so much the faculty on campus who were the object of the alienation and even suspicion and hostility for the faculty in the clinical departments. It was the university administration. And there was a litany of grievances ranging from not being paid to teach the medical students to not having any tuition relief when their children wanted to go to Brown, to parking, to recognition, to just, and I think it was isolation that testified, or that was at the root of this. So feeling that there was a crisis afoot, and maybe it's easier looking back. As clinicians, we know that the memory of pain in human beings is very short. That's why women have more than one child, and why men and women go through lots of things in life several times that are difficult or painful. But I remember being certainly energized. I thought you were going to ask a different question, and that is whether I worried about my personal life, which kind of got put in cold storage for the however long it was, I guess almost 3 years that I served as interim. On a personal level, I continued to be able to play squash and have dinner with my wife at least a couple nights a week. I put on my freshman 15 pounds the way the students did, not because of eating in the ratty, but because of all those business dinners out and business lunches out, and going from playing squash almost daily to a couple times a week. But I think the yield was worth it personally for me, and I have no regrets about having made the decision to do it. Also, I have to say that Bob Zimmer was an extraordinarily charismatic, brilliant, and prepared to be fully engaged in the medical school provost, and the opportunity to work really hand in hand with him on a daily basis was also compelling. And as I suspected, I learned a huge amount, not only from Bob and from Ruth, but also from doing that job. So I don't have any regrets.
Well, tell me a bit, no, that's actually gives a great background. Why don't you tell us a bit about your entering into the role of interim dean? What were some of the challenges, your accomplishments? What do you look back as in terms of process? What did you learn?
I think I had, when I came into the interimness, a good sense of reading people and enough personal maturity that in working with people, ego issues for me didn't get in the way of doing business. I think what I learned as dean was how to move that one-on-one management or negotiating or collaborating skill onto a broader playing field, working with large numbers of people. And I don't mean hundreds, but I mean with committees and councils and groups of chairs and center directors and, you know, the various administrative people in the division and in the medical school. I also had enormous assets. I know it sounds like I'm a proud husband, and I am, but I will tell you very objectively, Fox Weddell was an enormous asset in the public health program, not just in managing public health, but as part of my cabinet. Was then and remains an extraordinarily able strategic thinker and planner. I also inherited Fran McCrossan as the executive administrative dean for finance, or executive dean for finance and administration, and again, someone who did far more than manage the money. Fran McCrossan, smart and hardworking, absolutely devoted to the well-being of the medical school. He, I think, treated the medical school as a family member. or maybe given that families are imperfect organizations, maybe as well, anyway, a beloved relative. And we had Christine Heenan working with us as a contracted government relations person, and again, another powerful strategic thinker. She had worked on the Hill and actually had worked at Brown for a while and then started her own consulting company. And Ruth Rosenberg, again, I inherited from Don Marsh, special assistant, who did something that many leaders don't understand the critical importance of. There were not 2 meetings a week in a calendar filled with 7 or 8 meetings a day. There weren't 2 a week that Ruth Rosenberg didn't go to. She didn't go only really to one-on-one meetings that I had with the provost and with an occasional hospital CEO. She was in every other meeting, and in every meeting where there was more than one person that was my meeting, she was there. And she was there for 2 critical reasons. The first and most obvious was she kept track of what happened in the meeting, and I don't mean she took minutes. She kept track of what I and others needed to do, and either did or didn't say we needed to do after the meeting. And she and I would debrief after every meeting, if not immediately after, on the same day, and go over exactly what the outcomes, the desired and needed outcomes were of that meeting. And she would keep track of that meeting's decisions or plans that were made after the meeting occurred, and would track and report on and move along the things that needed to happen to optimize the value of that meeting. And I see today all around me examples of leaders who don't do that and have meetings after which nothing happens, even if not enough happens. The other thing that Ruth would do, besides making sure of the follow-through to a meeting, is that she would think and talk strategically with me about the importance of the meeting. So I had an immediate sounding board where I could reflect on the meeting. And the most important ones would come back to our weekly cabinet meetings, where I would have the benefit of Fran McCrossan and Christine Heenan and Fox and Ruth. And I think that was my, of course, and Ann Payton, who was our advancement officer. And the reason I forgot to mention Ann in the beginning is that she was recruited away in the second year of the interim, and so we limped along without a senior advancement officer for almost half of the time I was interim dean, and that was a big deficit. I think the biggest issues during the interim period were, first and foremost, in my mind, the relationship between the faculty and clinical departments and the medical school. Equally important was the relationship of the medical school to the affiliated hospitals. And Provost Zimmer initiated a process that he managed of meetings with Lifespan, and in the beginning there were 7 or 8 of us around the table. There was the provost, I was there as the dean of medicine, George Vecchione as CEO of Lifespan, Joe Amaral, the president of Rhode Island Hospital, Kathleen Hittner, the president of the Miriam Hospital, John Gillespie, George Vecchione's strategic planner, and a couple carpenters and a plumber. And over the course of a year, nothing got done because, I believe, there are many reasons that process didn't work. I mean, Bob Zimmer is one of the smartest humans I've ever met, but he had never overseen a medical school. He obviously was not a physician, had no understanding. It was a very quick study, but came to the table kind of as a blank slate. And he identified certainly very important issues. But on the other side, George Vecchione, a very, very smart businessman, very conservative, and would not, in front of his people, talk about anything very exciting and different. We talked about very small incremental changes, and not much got done. And it was after a year of these meetings that Bob Zimmer decided to abandon group meetings and meet one-on-one with George thereafter. And they came up with a product that was called a partnership that involved not just Lifespan, but all of the hospitals would participate, and there would be partnership relationships between the medical school and each of the affiliated hospitals or hospital groups. So it was Care New England and Memorial, and the VA actually was excluded, which I thought was a mistake also, because the VA has huge academic resources to deploy. And the partnership agreements were that money would flow from each of the hospitals to the medical school when the dean, in working with the clinical chairs, developed an academic plan for each of the hospitals. I thought that that was not a good solution, because in looking at an academic plan for each of the hospitals, I suspected and shared with Bob that such a commitment from the Dean of Medicine would mean that that would be about a half-time job, working with the clinical chairs. And as it was, I, as interim dean, of course I was a rookie interim dean, but I was in the office honestly 80 hours a week. And worked at home, and went to meals and events that I didn't count. So I didn't think that that was a feasible plan, and not to be a naysayer, but I can tell you now the partnership agreements were signed in December of 2004, and no academic plan has been generated, and no funds have flowed through the partnership agreements. As an interesting sidelight, there were new affiliations signed in 1997 with Lifespan, as you may know, based on the decision of Brown Medical School to disaffiliate with the Roger Williams Hospital and strengthen the affiliation with Lifespan. And that document also promised a funds flow from Lifespan to the medical school and a research and education foundation that would be capitalized by both Lifespan and the university, and not a dime flowed from that either. Throughout this period, the other affiliated hospitals, Memorial, Women and Infants, and Butler, the two teaching hospitals of Care New England. Am I leaving out a hospital? No, because they're the the three Lifespan hospitals. So those three non-Lifespan hospitals, two Care New England hospitals and Memorial, continued to send annual six-figure funds to the medical school for the use of the dean for academic programs. Now, there was an understanding that the programs to be funded by those dollars were programs in collaboration with those hospitals. Nevertheless, it supported academic programs that were the highest priority for the dean's office, and that was really the only discretionary money the dean of medicine had. And I guess that brings me to, I'll tell an anecdote, that's what these are for. When I had my interviews to meet the rest of the university leadership after the president and provost made the decision that I would be the interim dean, one of the persons I met with was Dick Spies from Princeton, who's a longtime associate of Ruth Simmons and came to be her chief strategic planner. And I shared with him, we were chatting, and he asked me about the medical school because he remembered there was one. And that was good for a senior administrator in the university to remember there's a medical school. And I said, well, this is an unusual medical school and it's an unusual deanship. None of the faculty is employed by the medical school, none of the faculty in clinical departments except for 2 or 3 chairs at the time. And the hospitals don't send money to the medical school, and therefore the dean really has no authority in the clinical environment. The dean has the usual authority over the public health and basic biology faculty who are university employees, but in the clinical environment, it's an extraordinarily weak deanship. In fact, the dean has less than $1 million a year of discretionary money. And in most medical schools, even granted that Brown is small and young, but most deans have double-digit millions of dollars a year of discretionary money to seed and support important academic programs. And so it's an extremely weak deanship. And I think this was in late May. You know, of 2002. I hadn't yet moved into the Arnold building. That was on July 1, 2002. And I said, it's an extremely weak deanship, and I think this interim is going to be really long. And Spies looked me in the eye and said with some authority and also kind of accusing me of being naive, and said, you don't know Ruth Simmons. She'll have an absolute star here in a year. And that was in May of 2002, and of course Eliadashi began end of January 2005. So it was an extremely long interim, and there were a number of candidates that came through who recognized the weakness of the deanship. I think Bob Zimmer was doing everything he could to strengthen the deanship, and ironically the transformational Warren Alpert Foundation gift of $100 million came after rather than during the recruitment of a new dean, and I think offers promise for strengthening the deanship. Of course, for that to happen, the money has to be used to make strong relationships for the deanship and the administration of the medical school with the entire faculty in the division and in the medical school. So we'll see how that plays out. But at the time, I mean, it's inconceivable to talk with a dean at any other medical school and talk about essentially no discretionary money. Some wonderful things happened that I am not going to take credit for. I think the relationship with the Marine Biological Laboratories at Woods Hole, Bob Zimmer did that, relating it to the Division of Biology and Medicine, and that was a wonderful event. The strengthening of graduate programs is something that went very well. Something I will say I had a hand in was the issue of basic science research space. When I became interim dean in 2002, it had been more than a decade since any new wet laboratory space was brought online at Brown. And during the period from, let's just say, 1995 to 2002, there were many senior faculty in the biology departments who were retiring. And that's not surprising. The medical school founded essentially late 60s, early 70s, an influx of faculty. Fast forward 30 years, they're ready for retirement. And what happens in wet laboratory research, as you probably know or certainly could figure out, is that as people mature from being young lion or lionesses, assistant professors and associate professors, and then full professors, towards their later 50s and perhaps early 60s, they tend to be less successful in bringing in grants. And so their laboratory space shrinks. And this senior professor then at 66 or 67 or 68 or 71 retires, and a search is undertaken to replace him or her with a young lion or lioness who has a need for 1,000 or even 1,500 square feet of laboratory space because they're bringing 3 grants and 5 graduate students and 4 technicians and another junior faculty member, and the person who's retired left behind 200 square feet and a chair. And I don't mean an endowed professorship, I mean a wooden chair that he or she was sitting on. Now that's an extreme example, but play that out 10 or 15 times over, and what you see is enormous strangulation of the research program. No room for people to do the research with the grants they have, much less bring on new people. So that was an acute problem, and the plan for the life sciences building was impacted, that is, ossified, in struggles with the local community on the one hand, who thought that the air was going to be poisoned by emissions from the building, and by the geography on the other, with the pizza place on one side wanting $13 million for a postage stamp plot of land, and bedrock granite 5 feet below ground, and the challenge to dig down so as to not exceed the height zoning requirements for what is essentially a residential neighborhood. And so, faced on July 1 with this urgent problem, I mean, literally there were recruitments backed up for 2 or 3 years because of an absence of laboratory space. So every day driving in from Barrington to the university, I would come in on 195, and just before I got off, before they closed exit 1 on 195, I'm starting to talk like a Rhode Islander now, where the Dunkin' Donuts used to be, I would see on the left-hand side of the road this kind of gleaming white concrete building with a banner hung on the side of it, and in 30-foot high letters it said, "For rent, call Belvoir Properties," and had a phone number. And I would just note that, and about the 20th day, the idea occurred to me, perhaps the medical school could rent a floor in that building and build it out for research space. I brought the idea to the provost, and he said, "Well, I don't know. Who's Belvoir Properties?" And I said, "I don't know. Can I call up?" And he said, "Sure." And it turned out to be Jim Winokur, a former corporation member and Brown graduate and benefactor. And I talked to him, and the whole building was vacant but for the administrative offices of the Providence YMCA. And so I talked with him. I began getting some grandiose ideas, not about a floor, but the whole 105,000 square foot building. Life Sciences was projected at 165,000 square feet, and even then, well before the ground was broken, the projected cost was somewhere in the low 90 millions. It eventually came in, I think, at about 105 or 8 or 9. And I thought that building on Ship Street, which ironically was the former factory for the Speidel Company, well, that's not particularly ironic, but I'll tell you what is the irony there. Speidel was owned and operated by Paul Levenger. Who's Paul Levenger? Paul Levenger is a man who left a great deal of money in his estate to the Miriam Hospital. And when Ed Jaffe, as president of the Miriam, got the idea to build an endowed professorship in honor of David Greer, who retired from the deanship in 1992, this was in the early and middle 1990s, they were $500,000 short and had exhausted the fundraising capacity at the time of the Miriam Hospital-centric donors. And the president of the Miriam Foundation, Ben Pastor, had the idea, reading the terms of the Levenger bequest, that money could be added to top off the Greer professorship, which brought me to Brown. And so, and what happened was, I brought to the provost the idea of the whole building, first thinking of rent. He and I talked, and it would obviously be more efficient in the long run to buy it. And with the enormously effective leadership of Beppe Heidekoper, the new chief financial officer of the university, the building was negotiated. It was bought for something like $14 million. The build out for laboratories brought it up to a total of maybe 33 million, 34 million. It was, the renovation began in September, and on August 11th of the following year, 2004, the building was opened and began to be populated. And when I left the deanship, Ruth Simmons gave me a framed photograph of the building, and at the lunch she said, "We would have named this the Besdine building, but we couldn't afford it." And so I felt very, very good about that. And into that building moved our Center for Genomics and Proteomics, headed by John Sedevy, whom I worked very closely with, a gerontologist of international repute. And actually, when the former chair of MCB, Sue Jerby. When Susan Jerby gave us 6 weeks' notice that she was retiring, stepping down as chair of that department, I and the provost talked John Sedevy into taking that chair of that department, and he hasn't regretted it. And he moved his laboratory and became that center director, and that's a thriving place into which we made 14 faculty recruitments in 2 years through the president's academic enrichment initiative in the basic biological sciences, every one of them a star. Now, they didn't all go into the Ship Street building, which we went around on a name for some months, and the one that I suggested in the beginning was the molecular medicine laboratory, and it came out dramatically revised to be the laboratories for molecular medicine, which was finally settled on by the very expensive branding consultant that the university hired, working with the president and provost and so on. So that building, the other good thing that happened, and I don't really take any credit for it other than being in the room for all of the conversations, is that the Life Sciences building, now Sidney Frank Hall, got launched, and Dick Spies and Beppy Heidekoper did heroic work along with the president and provost to get that building moved along, not only in working with the city, but working with the abutting neighbors on the east side, and the bedrock granite that had to go 2 stories down for the MRI equipment that is at the heart of our neuroimaging research program. So that was a big deal. Faculty recruitment, research space, relationship with the hospitals, kind of dominated.
And
the
fundraising?
Yeah, oh yeah, we had a few fundraising successes. One that I remember in particular, the father of one of our graduating medical students in 2003, Barrett Brady. Actually, he pronounces it Breedy. I only learned that since I left the deanship. Everybody was calling it Brady, but it's Breedy. The father, Rick, a very successful business entrepreneur, sold, what's his company, not NorCal, that's the insurance company, Nortec maybe, sold it for $90 million. I had a lunch with him and got the largest donation to the medical school scholarship fund, $1 million, which for the medical school at that time was an extraordinary gift. We also were able to, the endowment was already there, but one of the major headaches of the interim period was that we had been unable to fill the Levenger professorship at Brown. This was a professorship, again, established from the Levenger bequest, but separately from the money that was put into the Greer professorship. And for 6 or 7 years, there had been fits and starts and hiccups, but no consummation. The idea was that it was to be in cardiology, and as you probably know, there had been a great deal of turmoil in cardiology, a struggle to establish a strong academic identity in the face of a very powerful community-based clinical cardiology program. And so the family was arguing that the money should be returned to the estate, and we were able to dance through that legal minefield of a suit brought by the family and successfully recruit a strong academic leader in cardiology and fill that professorship. There were a lot of, I guess in any administration, there are what at the time appear to be major crises that you look back on and say, you know, nobody died and we got the work done.
And the Warren Alpert, did that begin during your time?
Yes, I had even forgotten about it, but I had a first meeting with the president of the Warren Alpert Foundation, Kaplan, Herb Kaplan.
He's, I think, his nephew. Perhaps they're related?
I didn't know of a relationship, but I met with Mr. Kaplan in 2003, a first meeting. My recollection is vague. I was reminded by Susan Meradian that I did have that meeting at which we talked globally about medical school issues. Given the wealth of the company, we talked in terms of an endowment of the deanship, which was one of the possible ways to strengthen the deanship. There wasn't even an endowed professorship for the dean. And we talked about $5 million to do that. and it was a conversation after which we all agreed that that philanthropy was Boston-centric, and it was unlikely that we would see much from that, and look what the advancement people were able to do. Just a phenomenal story. But it was only at the, I had completely forgotten that interaction, I guess because at the time it seemed like it was going nowhere, but it in fact was, according to the development people, the foundation on which they built their continuing and ongoing relationship. There was a lot of action in development. I would say that, you know, looking back from 2007, the monies that we aspired to were small monies, and we had some small wins. One might even say that the $1 million for the scholarship fund, in retrospect, wasn't, it made people feel very, very good at the time. The interest income on $1 million annually doesn't buy very many medical school tuitions, is the reality.
No, I think those stories and anecdotes are key. Are there other areas where you remember that were accomplishments, major issues, challenges?
Absolutely. I haven't talked at all about probably the single most important issue for Brown Medical School in its service to the students and the families who pay tuition to get a medical education. It's not a well-known fact, but Brown Medical School did not then, in 2002, 3, 4, and 5, and does not now, have a building, period. We share space in the Biomed Center with graduate students and undergraduates. We share space in the Arnold Building with a whole variety of programs. But there is not an administrative and instructional building that either says on it Brown Medical School, or now Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University. And that was, not only that, but the facilities for medical education in the Biomed Center being the facilities essentially that were created back in the 80s and 90s. I think the last part of the Biomed Center was open in 1992. Meant that the size of the medical school was fixed by the size of the anatomy suite and the number of tables that would fit in it. That actually turned out to be not exactly right. But one of the highest priorities I had was to identify first a place for a building that would be the home base of the medical school, and then to get it built. And based on the experiences prior to my becoming interim dean, and then while interim dean, regarding what is now Sidney Frank Hall, the Life Sciences Building, I proposed to the provost and said publicly in Ruth Simmons' cabinet meeting that I went to every Monday morning, along with the other 12 senior officers of the university, that I believe that the medical school must have a building and that it should not be on College Hill. Even if the space could be identified, we shouldn't try to build another medical school-related building on College Hill. One, because the cost and the administrative headaches would be huge, but second, the idea of being closer to where our medical students get their clinical training would make sense. And I actually had in mind at that time the land that is going to be freed up when the highways are relocated. That 24 acres that are now under the 195-95 intersection of waterfront space. That turned out actually not to be feasible because the wait to get that land, it's still probably 7 or 8 years away. At the time, a few years ago, it seemed reasonable to wait a decade because it would probably be that long before there was the money. With the Warren Alpert gift, there is the prospect of being able to build that building almost right away, and the Rhode Island, or the Women and Infants Hasbro Rhode Island Hospital campus seems a very attractive locus. So that is a huge issue, and I believe that I'm the person who first articulated the absolute, unequivocal centrality of that as an issue to confront in the decade of 2000 to 2010, and not just wait around. The second thing, again, I live this on a daily basis. I don't know how I could have forgotten to talk about it, and that is the medical school curriculum. As dean of a medical school, I thought it might be important to actually see what our students were experiencing. And so from that first semester, starting in August of 2002, I began, every other month going to a class of the medical school, either the first or second year, and managed over the course of a couple years to attend probably 10 sessions of medical school, maybe a dozen. And it was wonderful. It was anatomy and physiology and biochemistry and organ system blocks, and it was just like the curriculum I had from 1961 to 1965 at Penn Medical School. And then walking back to the dean's office one day from attending a session, it struck me that that might not be good. When I left Harvard in 1986, I had spent 2 years working on but missed the implementation of the then brand new integrated curriculum called the New Pathway, which was one of the earliest to be an integrated curriculum. And then from over the 20 years following the mid-1980s, there were 25 or 30 medical schools that did major curriculum revision, moving to integration. And so the absence of an integrated curriculum at Brown struck me as not something to do that's exciting and innovative, but really just catch-up ball. And I talked about that, not too publicly because I was cautioned. I got my wrist slapped by the provost twice in the almost 3 years I was interim dean. Once, when in a cabinet meeting that the provost was unable to attend, I got asked how the conversations with Lifespan were going about negotiating this partnership deal, and I used the D word, and I got taken to the woodshed for that one. I said that I found it disappointing that the level of conversation and what was on the table was disappointingly small. And the second time was when, again, it was in the cabinet, the issue of the medical school curriculum came up, and I said I was a little embarrassed that at Brown, a place that is world-renowned for its innovation and successful experimentation with undergraduate education, we had a medical school curriculum that was 1970s at best and maybe 1950s. And I was told to find other ways to talk about that. But the good news is I did find other less pejorative ways to talk about that, and happily the current administration, Deans Adachi and Grapuso, have followed through on those kind of piecemeal efforts we made to do some integrating of course material so that the students would study the heart not sequentially in anatomy, then physiology, then pathophysiology, then pharmacology, then pathology, but rather to take all those sciences and present the integrated information together, which from a teaching perspective is more difficult to do, but from a learning perspective is much more authentic and efficient to learn about all aspects of the organ in question at the same time. And that's the direction that the curriculum is now moving. And I feel very pleased that that's occurring. And again, a bit of an irony, I am far more involved than I ever thought I would be, both because as the former interim dean who was interested in curriculum, I'm participating on several of the working groups, one of which you chair. But in addition, when I left the deanship, I wrote a grant proposal to the Reynolds Foundation to, in lockstep with the redesign of the medical school curriculum, add adequate aging content. And the medical school got a $2 million award. I'm the PI from the Reynolds Foundation to do exactly that, and we're, winding up our first year of work on that project. So, and it's thrilling, and so I feel I, in some ways, made my own bed, and it's a very comfortable bed. Good night's sleep in it. Let me talk. I didn't talk about relationships with the hospital CEOs. And if there was one thing I was warned about coming into the interim deanship, it was watch out for the big bad wolves. That the hospital CEOs were a bunch of cutthroat, bloodthirsty, difficult to deal with, business savvy, hardheads, and most of that turned out not to be true. I think my relationship with the hospital CEOs, they, unlike the university and the clinical departments, did not embrace me as the real dean. I think one of the reasons the interim went so well is that I thought I was the real dean. I behaved that way. There were many issues that had to be dealt with, and certainly in the departments, both on campus and in the hospitals, I think the chairs and the faculty and the administrators regarded me as having the authority of the dean, which I did, and also recognizing after the first year, and there was very little progress on the search, that it was going to be a long interim and we had to get on with business. My sense with the CEOs is that they knew they could wait it out. They didn't really have to deal seriously with me, and I think most of them didn't. I had some, what I would call, wins over issues of hospital relationships, but the fact is Lifespan is now the big dog, and the provost was dealing with Lifespan, and I don't think the provost got much further than I did. And of course, there are now another set of negotiations going on with Lifespan, and we'll see where that goes. I think that each of the CEOs stands out, but I remember particularly being warned about two of them, Tom Parrish and Frank Dietz. Parrish, the CEO of Women and Infants Hospital, was the man who sat at the table, and I met monthly with the hospital CEOs, and he had a pet saying, and he would manage to say it at, if not every meeting, every other meeting, and it was, Brown tells us what to do and then gives us the bill. which might have had at one time a bit of truth in it, but certainly not in the modern era. And he actually stepped down during my interim, and Connie Howes was appointed CEO. And I think of all the CEOs, she was the one who dealt most seriously with me, and we got a lot of good things done. We got the Center of Excellence in Women's Health funded, and that was certainly a collaborative effort, not just in preparing the proposal, but on the site visit of the administration of the medical school and the hospital. Frank Dietz is a force unto himself, and what I said about Frank during the interim deanship, I continue to say about him. He's a strong personality. He has strong views. He's dedicated to his hospital. He's been very successful financially. Yes, he can be explosive and hard-headed, but the fact is, if you look at the data, Frank Dietz puts more money per faculty member or per hospital bed or per medical student, whatever your unit of analysis, into academics than any hospital CEO, certainly in Rhode Island, and maybe than any east of the Mississippi. And for that, he had my enduring respect, and therefore, that he would yell at people sometimes or be hard-headed and difficult to deal with and not let people make Xerox copies and give only one computer to a cluster of faculty is tolerable. George Vecchione is an extremely successful hospital administrator, had success in New York, has success here. It's hard to know what George is thinking. He plays his cards close to the vest, and so far he's outmaneuvered deans and provosts alike when it comes to financial negotiations.
And any other stakeholders with whom you had interactions that were memorable?
The corporation is a very interesting creature.
The Brown Corporation.
The Brown Corporation. And certainly Ruth Simmons keeps the corporation as is proper for the university president as her counsel. She is diligent in reminding her senior officers, and that her senior officers should remind on down the line, that approaching corporation members for particular asks by individual faculty members is not to be done. And so even as interim dean of the medical school, I had very limited exposure to the corporation, with the exception of two corporation members who were appointed on my watch, Mark Blumenkrantz, a physician graduate in the first class, and then Galen Henderson, a graduate of the 1980s, both distinguished physicians. Mark Blumenkrantz, a distinguished chair of ophthalmology at Stanford, a very smart, thoughtful guy, a very successful academic administrator. In the moment, he was 100% attentive. I thought he could be a significant ally in advancing the medical school agenda. It's important for me to say that at the time I became interim dean, there was one physician on the had Mark already been appointed? Maybe he was appointed in the year I became interim dean. And that was the only physician on the corporation. The corporation was undergraduate college centric. That's why they were on the corporation. That's what was near and dear to them. And to say that the medical school was occasionally an afterthought for the corporation, I think is accurate. And I think it was during the years of the interim that the medical school, by nature of the investments being made and the intention paid to it by the president and the provost, the medical school was born in the corporation. In other words, it became a continuous identity for the corporation, as opposed to, oh, right, a medical school. Oh, yeah, we have a medical school. And I don't take credit for that. I think it's more a matter of the issues that we dealt with for the medical school, of new research space, of a building, of expanding admissions, expanding the size of the school, of recruiting new chairs, of having higher aspirations for the academic standing, both regionally and nationally. All of these things and the fundraising behind that made the corporation have to pay attention to the medical school. I think there still is a transition occurring that will be complete when there's a building. And there are more. We also redesigned the corporation relationship to the medical school. When I became interim dean, there was the CCBA, the Corporation Committee on Biomedical Affairs, that had a sprinkling of corporation members, but most of the membership were either former corporation members or people recruited because of their special interest in or knowledge of the medical school. Yes, certainly from a cadre of individuals who were sympathetic to Brown, if not graduates, then with children or some other connection. But transitioning from that exclusively advisory body to an actual oversight, and now there are two groups actually. There's the oversight, which I think still goes through academic affairs, and then there's this separate group that looks more like the old CCBA, that is populated with some corporation members and some not, that is advisory as opposed to decisional. But the very process of the corporation not struggling, but working with the president to design these new structures, again brought the medical school more into the rooms that the corporation met in, and the work they did between meetings.
Were there any other individuals you haven't mentioned that, or groups that stand out from your time that you felt in some way deserve special note, or with which you were particularly proud to bring them here, or to help them to move from point A to point B? Or who influenced you? You've mentioned the provost, you've mentioned the president, some of the people in your office.
I'm sure I've forgotten some important people and important events. If I had been as smart as I sometimes think I am, I would have done some prep for this by reviewing my gigabytes of documents that are in one folder with dozens of subfolders on my computer that says deanship. But I think I've hit most of the highlights there. I haven't spoken at all about the clinical chairs. I should talk about them. The chairs of the clinical departments at Brown, at least half of them are first-rate chairs. There were some who weren't first-rate chairs who have been replaced either on my watch or subsequently. But I would say as a group, one of the interesting things about our chairs of clinical departments, particularly the ones that are foundation presidents, and I'm not going to describe that because you know what that is, and so do most people who will be looking at this tape decades from now, are really a unique breed in academic medicine in America. That is to say, they virtually are Chinese warlords, which is to say accountable to no one but their own foundations. That's changing as, and this is a very important issue going forward, these foundations individually are strong, but Brown is probably the only medical school left in the country where the clinical departments are not in some kind of joint enterprise on the clinical side. They do not share anything but email, and they don't share anything. They don't share appointments, they don't share administrative staff, they don't share purchasing and billing and negotiate, nothing. They are absolutely independent, and that independence, I think, comes at a price tag that is intolerably high in the modern era of academic medicine, and I think that's something that will have to change. I would only say that in the time I was interim dean, the chair I worked most closely with, that is, had the most interaction with, is the chair of my own department, Ed Wing. I also worked closely with Marty Keller in psychiatry because there were a lot of issues in his department. Ed is an absolutely devoted academic chair and has the academic interests of the medical school near and dear to his heart. I think some of the other chairs, less interested in the academic well-being of the medical school and more focused on their own departments. And so their willingness to give any authority over what goes on in their departments to a dean was limited at the time. And so I don't think we had any really big wins in the clinical departments other than some notable faculty recruitments, but nothing important happened in the administrative relationship of the clinical departments to the medical school. And I see that still as an area in great need, and what's happening now concerns me deeply because I see at Lifespan, where the foundations exist, I see George Vecchione with his now senior medical officer, Arthur Klein, another extremely smart and able guy. I see them working and making progress in creating a federation of these foundations and having some authority and control over them, and the medical school is not in that process. And so the strength that the medical school could bring to the academic agenda is now in the hands of individual chairs, and as individuals they can't exert the pressure to keep academics on the front burner. So I worry about that, and it's something that I wanted to have on the table in the Lifespan negotiations, but the provost didn't want to attack that. His highest priority was to get all the research done in the hospitals managed administratively in the university so that the university would have credit for all the grants, and we'd be number 38 instead of number 68 or 70 in NIH grant capture rankings, which is really the only marker of medical school ranking. U.S. News and World Reports does one, but the people who matter really look at the NIH rankings.
And what would you like your legacy to be? How would you like to be remembered as interim dean or dean?
I think you said it. I think the most important thing I did was to get the majority of constituencies to regard me as the dean and take me seriously and be brought into all the stuff we did. of getting a building, of growing both the basic science and public health faculty. I mean, I didn't say anything about public health because my wife is the public health dean, but I was the dean who urged the provost to move forward on the expansion of public health, more than doubling of the tenured faculty, getting a building, and moving from a program in public health to a school. I certainly am a strong advocate for that. Given that my wife is the dean, you know, we had to be had to build some firewalls. So I think the accomplishments in launching the idea of a building, and fortuitously the funding has come, getting more research, an administrative and instructional building, getting new research space, both life sciences and the laboratories for molecular medicine, growing the faculty, redoing the curriculum. These are all setting the goals for standard admission again and growing the class. These are all things I'm proud to have occurred on my watch. I think the vast majority of progress is the result of the work of many, many people, and you know, Fran McCrossan and Fox Weddle did heroic service during the interim and probably are responsible for most of the good ideas that went forward. And Bob Zimmer. I mean, I think it was a huge loss that when he went to the University of Chicago. It's a presidency I think he's wanted for 20 years, so it's no faulting of him. It would have been nice if it had been 3 or 4 years later. That's enough.
Well, Professor Besdine, Richard, it has been a pleasure. This is the end of the interview with Professor Richard Besdine. It is April 13th, 2007, and we are sitting in his office in the Gerontology building on the corner of
Hope and Stimson.
Stimson.